All hail King Jesus. What a great song to sing coming into an election week. I'm serious. I don't know who you're going to vote for, and after that, frankly, I don't really care. Going off the reservation here a little bit. I hope you vote this week. I hope you make your voices heard. But I don't care who you vote for, because I ultimately know who will place our next president into office. I know by whom nations fall and rise. And while the president may make our lives a little sweeter or a little more difficult in the coming years, ultimately neither candidate will make an eternal difference for you and I. And so we can worship the Lord this morning in full confidence that He is in control this week and in the weeks to follow, and I'm grateful for that. And that's who we worship. We have come into a sanctuary over the past several weeks as we are learning about the tabernacle. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 25 today. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to find Exodus 25 as we begin our study. As we head that direction, let me just make a couple quick announcements. Last week we had this really incredible event. The trunk or treat was a smashing success. We had over 800 of our neighbors show up and take all the free candy that you provided. So can we just celebrate that? It was such a huge turnout that Allison woke up with a fever today and stayed home. So our kids program is without their leader this morning, but their volunteers are well trained and ready to go. She called me this morning, said, I'm not feeling very well, but we've got an ace team and they're going to do a great job and everything's totally fine. I'm like, okay, if you say so, I trust you. So I don't smell smoke. I think we're all good. And we're just going to go as if that's the case. So great event with the trunk or treat this week. It was so fun. Just tons and tons of people. It was wild and just really enjoyable evening to spend with so many people in our community. This week we also have several other events coming up. We have a men's breakfast in the middle of the week and women's event on the weekend. So make sure you're reading through the program so that you get the details on all those things. We won't take time to lay out all the details for you, but those are in your program. We want to jump back into the holy place. So grateful for Caleb and his ability to kind of take care of us last weekend as he introduced us to the menorah, the great candlestick, that 6-foot tall, solid gold candlestick, weighed probably 75 pounds, that gave light to the holy place. We are moving into this space again. There are 3 pieces of furniture found just inside the tabernacle in what is known as the holy place. It is not the Holy of Holies. That is the inner sanctuary. In the tent, there were 2 rooms, and the first one has 3 pieces of furniture. The menorah that you talked about last week, the table of showbread that we're going to look at this morning, and the incense altar that we'll talk about next weekend. These 3 pieces are the furnishings of the space where God meets mankind, right? People filled the courtyard. They made sacrifices at the altar. The priests washed their hands of the blood of the sacrifice in the basin we talked about a couple weeks ago. But you and I would have gone no further. We would have only ever visited the outer courtyard, the outside spaces. We would not have, myself nor you, none of us would have gone into the tent. It was reserved only for the priests. I would be more of a rabbi. So like the rest of you, I would have brought my sacrifices. A priest who would have been born into that role, being a part of the tribe of Levi, would have cared for our sacrifices, but we would have stayed in the outer courtyard. Only the priests would enter into the tent itself, into the tent of meeting, where they would commune with the Lord while they represented us, and where they would care for the furnishings that were in there. And so the Holy of Holies was just for God. The outer courtyard was where we all hung out, and the middle space in between is where the priests would go and they would interact with the God of the universe on our behalf. The Christ is found in each of the furnishings in this center space where God meets mankind, where God is truly with us. Christ is represented most appropriately in these furnishings with the lampstand, the table, and the altar of incense. As we step into this space, we see that the lamp illuminates. It is the only source of light, as Caleb mentioned last week. It lights the space inside the tent. The table, as we will see shortly, is filled with bread on a weekly basis. So if the lamp illuminates, the table nourishes. Next week, we'll look more closely at the incense altar, which is a summoning furnishing, where the prayers of God's people rise in fragrant offering, standing before the veil, just on the other side where God's glory resided. So let's look at the table and the bread. In Exodus chapter 25, we have a description of this table. It's a small table. The Lord gives these instructions starting with verse 23. Make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long. Remember, a cubit is about 1.5 feet, give or take. So a table that is 2 cubits long is only about 3 feet long, a cubit wide, so maybe 18 inches or so wide, and 1.5 cubits high, so somewhere approaching, 27 inches or so. Overlay it with pure gold and make a gold molding around it. Also make it around it a rim a handbreadth wide and put a gold molding on the rim. Make 4 gold rings for the table and fasten them to the 4 corners where the 4 legs are. The rings are to be close to the rim to hold the poles used in carrying the table. Make the poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold, and carry the table with them, and make its plates and dishes of pure gold, as well as its pitchers and bowls for the pouring out of offerings. Put the bread of the presence on the table to be before me at all times. And so we have this detailed instructions for the structure, for the craftsmanship of this table. It is made of wood. It is overlaid in gold. We've talked several times already. Wood symbolizes mankind. Gold represents or symbolizes God himself. And so we have a table that is both made of mankind, flesh, and God, the divine. Who is the table? Help me out. Who's the table? Man and God is Jesus Christ, right? The table is Jesus Christ. It's important to recognize this. The table is symbolic of Christ's not only presence where God meets man, but the work to be done. You'll notice that all of the utensils, the plates, the bowls, the pitchers, they are made of solid gold. And so as we talk through today, what happens at the table, who makes these things happen? The utensils, the things used to serve, are solid gold. God himself is the one who provides what we will be talking about in the coming minutes. I hope as we've talked about the pieces of furniture already and as we look forward to the next ones, I hope that you're appreciating the incredible significance and symbolism of the tabernacle. It is a divinely revealed picture or model come straight from heaven to Moses to sit at the very center of God's people. We've said it at the beginning each week that it represents a very real place, the place that we look forward to occupying for all of eternity, the throne room of God, to be welcome and ushered into his very presence for all of eternity. That is pretty incredible. To get a glimpse of that here on earth is a blessing certainly none of us deserve. And yet God in his graciousness has given us this vivid description of the tabernacle. Not only does it represent this very real place, but it shows us how it's possible to have this kind of a relationship with God. it lays out the entire plan of redemption for us. We talked about God's plan of redemption several years ago with the Feast Day series, that God rescues, restores, promises, provides, summons, and separates, that he might dwell with his people. We see the exact same pattern here. Have you caught that? Have you seen the significance of the altar that saves us, rescues us from our sins, the basin or laver that restores us by sanctifying us to make us holy in God's sight? We step in, we see the promise of the Messiah thousands of years before he comes in the golden lampstand. Not only do we see the promise of Messiah, but we see the promise of the Holy Spirit in the 7 bowls aflame with the light. We have God's promises for his future interactions with the world through his Son, by the power of his Spirit, in the work of his church, as mentioned last week when Caleb laid it out for us. We not only have God's promises, but we have his provision. We're going to talk about the table today. No doubt you are pretty familiar with tables and their uses. We're going to talk about that here as we go along, but the table is a place of provision where God not only says, trust me, I have a plan and I want to do these wonderful things for you, but he paves a path for us to get there. And we see that represented in the table. He promises and provides. Next week, he summons to himself to step as a priest to the very curtain, the veil that stood separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. Here stands an altar representing the prayers of God's people, where we summon God and he calls us to himself, as close as you could physically get to God's glory without being in his presence. He summons to himself. He has been summoning his people to himself all through history. He continues to do so today. But he is holy, and so he must separate that which is wicked from the righteous. He can only be in the presence of that which is righteous. When we get to the Ark of the Covenant, we'll talk about the separation of the righteous from the wicked. There are incredible examples of that all through the scriptures, where the Ark is very present and very active in separating God's people from those who are not. And then we finish with the mercy seat, where the Shekinah glory of God dwelt. The pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud came and rested over the mercy seat, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, and God dwelt with his people. The feasts and the furniture all tell the story of God. He is a rescuing, restoring, promising, providing, summoning, and separating God. And he does those things that he might dwell with you. It is an incredible picture of who he is. It gives us the plan of salvation and lays out just how God brings us into his presence. Not only does he give instructions for the table, but he gives instructions for the bread that will be served on the table. Take the finest flour, he says this time in Leviticus chapter 24. Take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. 2/10 of an ephah of flour is somewhere between probably 7 and 8 pounds. Any bakers in the house? Bakers? 5-pound bag of flour. Take that and half of another bag. Make a loaf of bread with that kind of flour. That is a substantial loaf of bread, right? By the time you mix all the other stuff in, each loaf of bread that sat on the table of showbread probably weighed close to 10 pounds. That's a lot of bread. These aren't cute little wafers, right? We've all been cheated in church when we're celebrating communion. We're pinching off these tiny little pieces, right? These were 10-pound loaves of bread, 2 stacks of 6. Let's continue reading from Leviticus. 12 loaves of bread, honkin' bread maybe, using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. Arrange them in 2 stacks, 6 in each stack, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. By each stack, put some pure incense. This was frankincense. You remember frankincense? We're coming toward Christmas. It was one of the 3 gifts given to the Christ child by the Magi. It was the incense of a priest. Only a priest would have used frankincense. It was a holy spice that was sacred to the Hebrew people. They were to only use it for worship in the tabernacle. And so this bread was laid on the table, put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday. So every Saturday, 12 new loaves are brought in. The old loaves are taken, the new loaves are placed Sabbath after Sabbath on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. We have this finely prepared and ground flour that is crafted and kneaded into this unleavened bread. Right? No leavening agent, so you don't have all the little gas bubbles in the bread. It doesn't puff up like most of the breads that we make. It was a flatbread, a 10-pound flatbread, so it probably looked like a plate you might find in your local gym. It was a heavy loaf of bread. It was baked by the finest craftsmen. 12 loaves arranged in 2 stacks. It accompanied the frankincense. And each week, a new 12 loaves of bread was prepared. This purest of bread, 12 loaves, represents, as you probably have already figured out, the 12 tribes of Israel. They represent the entirety of the community that surrounded the tabernacle. These 12 tribes encamped around the tabernacle are represented by these 12 loaves sitting on the table each and every week, always before the Lord. The bread is baked by the priests and brought in. The old bread is taken. The new bread is presented before the Lord in these 2 stacks, these 12 loaves. Exodus 25:30 that we already read says, put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times. There was never a moment where God's people did not sit before him in the holy place. While you and I could not physically enter into the tabernacle, we were represented by these loaves of bread. Always before the Lord. The table is a place of presentation or representation. And we do this with tables still, don't we? Sometimes tables are simply put in a space to present something, an award, a trophy. We had a buffet in the dining room at the house I grew up in. Kids, if you are under the age of 20, do you have any idea what a buffet is? Probably not. It's a fancy table, right? It's an ornate, fancy table. Our buffet stood about this high. It was a long table. It had kind of ornate sides on the top of it and a shelf above it. And so it was a table with another little shelf or table above it. The back had a mirror on it. There were these ornate carvings in the wood. It had fancy drawers that had beautiful carvings on the faces of all the drawers. We kept the dishes we never used in there. The dishes my parents got for their wedding, and they tucked away, and in my childhood, I think we maybe used them 3 times, right? These were where we put our holy utensils. Those dishes and cups and saucers and cream pitchers and butter dishes, all those things that were so wonderful and so fragile, my mom didn't dare bring them out while the kids were still at home. They were sacred to her. They were special to her. They came out at the most special of occasions. This buffet was this fancy table that had almost nothing on it except for a few pictures. Some great-grandparents. Eventually, pictures of grandparents who had passed away. We sat at the dining room table right next to the buffet all the time for our meals. And when we would sit at the dining room table and have our family gatherings, when we had friends over, when we had meals or played cards or sat in that dining room, there was presented before us a reminder of those people who were close to us but not physically present in the room at the moment. It was a table of presentation. We do this all the time. If you have been to a memorial service, they have tables with pictures of the deceased. We have tables at the back of our room. There's all kinds of information on there. They are tables of presentation. Here are the places you might get involved and plug in here as part of this church. They're tables of presentation. Nobody eats at those tables. They just present information. There is a table in the lobby. A small round table, much like this one. The only thing on it, typically, is a basket. It's a place where if you are a part of this congregation and you give regularly to it, that you can present an offering to the Lord and for His work. It's a table of presentation. The table that sat in the in the holy place was, among other reasons, there for presentation or representation. The priests presented the bread that represented the people before God week in and week out. God says to have it always before my face or always in my presence. You know, God had said before this that when His people were enslaved in Egypt, He saw their suffering. They were, again, in His gaze. They were before His face. And here they are still before His face. They were the object of His attention. And so these loaves are set there as a statement, as a reminder that God always sees His people. He's always aware of your situations, of your needs, of your desires. The table, Christ, still presents God's people before a holy God. Our priest, Jesus Christ, as discussed in the video before we began this morning, has taken up the responsibility or the duty or the honor of presenting us before the Father. Hebrews 7 says, "Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office, but because Jesus lives forever, He has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, He's able to save completely those who come to God through Him. Because He always, what? He always lives to intercede for them. Like the table, He holds us before God's presence. He represents us before a holy and righteous God, and He presents us to God as a beautiful offering, as an expression of our adoration to Him. And the detail is given to us that at the end of the week, or at the beginning of the new week, new bread is brought in. We have 12 mega loaves that have been sitting out in the open on a table in the middle of a desert for a week. And the Lord, in His generosity, has given those loaves to the priests to eat. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? Week-old bread in the desert. But oral tradition tells us that when the new loaves were brought in and set on the table and the old loaves were taken out, they were still hot and fresh. Because the table is not only for presentation, it is also a place of provision. Just like most of our tables at home, it's a place where we take our sustenance, where we are nourished together as a family. This table was not only a place for God's people to be presented before him, but it was a place for God to then remind them of his great providing love for them. And the priests would take out these week old loaves, and they were still warm, they were still fresh, they were not moldy, and they were able to share the loaves amongst the priestly clan. The showbread was a reminder of God's incredible promised provisions. Leviticus 24:9 says it, referring to the consecrated bread, belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area because it is a most holy part. Holy simply means set aside for special purposes. This is a most holy part of their perpetual share of the food offerings presented to the Lord. You see, God was providing for his servants. They didn't own land like the other 11 tribes. The priestly tribe of Levi, they were scattered not with their brothers. They were scattered amongst the other tribes, that you don't want all your priests all in one place. And so this was a way for God to care for the priests who had been set aside to serve him throughout his kingdom. And so God was providing for his servants as a reminder, as an example of how he provides for all of his people. And there is this really interesting reference to the consecrated bread that was reserved for the priests that we find in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus and his disciples are walking along the road. They were traveling among the towns, teaching, and Jesus was healing the sick. And as they walked from one town to another on one particular Sabbath day, they were walking past some grain fields that were ripe. And his disciples, as they were walking, had grown hungry, and so they kind of swiped a few of the grains as they walked along. Someone saw this, realized this is a Sabbath, and picking grain technically is considered work. And so they took offense that Jesus' disciples were doing work by harvesting grain, rubbing it in their hands to knock off the chaff, and then eating the tender grain inside. And they were ridiculed for working on the Sabbath. And Jesus responds by reminding them of a passage in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 21, where King David's men had been fighting battles, and they were moving from one place to another. And because they had been engaged in these exhausting battles for several days, they were famished, they were hungry, they hadn't taken time to rest or to feed themselves. And as they were passing by the tabernacle of the Lord, David asked the priest, "Is there any bread available for us to eat?" And the priest said, "We don't have any regular bread. All we have is the consecrated bread, that which was in the tabernacle, that which was set aside for Aaron and the priests." And it was given to David, and he and his men had their fill of the sacred consecrated bread. And Jesus points out this story. He reminds them that while the bread was set aside for the priests, the bread sat on the table as a way to remind both God and the people of their beautiful relationship together and God's provision for them. And after Jesus tells this story and reminds them that even David's men ate the holy, sacred, consecrated bread, his disciples were simply picking some grain from a field as they walked by. Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." You see, God has given us instructions. He's given us his law that we might interact with one another in appropriate fashion, that we wouldn't abuse or harm one another. But the law is meant to be a guide for our benefit, not a prison to enslave us to a God who simply wants to control. The Lord has given the Sabbath for our benefit. The Lord has set aside instructions for the consecrated bread, for the benefit, for the provision of his servants. And in that particular case, out of 1 Samuel, those serving the Lord who had great need for nourishment were David and his army. God cares for his people. He provides for their needs. We see Jesus in John 6, in his teaching, refer to himself as the bread of life 3 different times. You see, Jesus had just performed the miracle where he fed 5,000 people by just a couple loaves, a couple fish. And the disciples, after everybody had kind of scattered, the crowds had dissipated and gone their way, the disciples are trying to make sense of what they've seen. This rabbi that we've been following just fed a massive crowd of people with a few loaves of bread. They're remembering how God had fed his people in the wilderness for 40 years by giving them manna each day, miraculously providing that they might be able to survive this harsh environment. And as they're trying to process how God continues to provide bread for his people, Jesus declared to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The table, holding the bread, symbolizes Christ's involvement in both presenting and providing for us. And in that passage in John, Jesus is claiming to be the perfect fulfillment of the table of showbread. The perfect fulfillment of God's providing his life-giving provisions for us. There is one more lesson. Tables are definitely a place for presentation. They are often, maybe usually even, a place of provision. But tables also have this very special place in our culture, and they have for all of history, where tables are a place of fellowship or communion, where ideas are shared, where concerns are laid out on the table, where conflicts are resolved, where turkeys are devoured. Something happens at meals shared. We gather with loved ones. We gather with neighbors and others who are important to us. And when we share meals, there is a companionship that happens, isn't there? When you share food with another, when you share drink with another, there's a deep emotional connection that is made that doesn't happen other places. In fact, this companionship, the word itself is beautiful. If you're a linguist, if you're fascinated by language, think about the word. Let's break it down. The prefix on the front end of this word, com, in Latin and Spanish and several other Romance languages, this means with. We're doing something with another. The suffix at the end, the ion, just like ian, means one who does something, right? A champion is the one who has overcome. The middle, pan. Spanish speakers, what is pan? Bread. Companion. One with whom I share bread. In the tabernacle, we are made companions. We have fellowship. We have communion with the God of the universe. It is where God and mankind come together to become friends, to become companions. When Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem in the middle of the Gospel of Luke, he is in Galilee. And the Bible tells us that he knew his time had come. He resolutely sets out for Jerusalem, where he knows he will be killed. And he goes from Galilee to Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. From Galilee to Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. Why does he go to Jericho? When Jesus reached the spot walking through Jericho, he looked up and he said to Zacchaeus, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your home today." So he came down at once, welcomed him gladly. Jesus had an appointment to make a companion of an outcast. At the end of scriptures in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, Jesus says to the world, to his churches, really, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and" what? "And eat." I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. The God of the universe, the Savior of the world, has a desire to share a meal with you, to break bread with you, to deepen his friendship with you, to be the most loyal and compassionate of companions. We see this increasing intimacy that happens as we move from the courtyard into the holy place toward the Holy of Holies in our relationship with the Lord. Our sin is forgiven at the altar. The consequences are addressed at the basin. God's promises are revealed in the candlestick. His provisions are made, not just for presence or tolerance of the audience, but for the possibility of real relationship. We look forward to see how the plan continues to play out as we study the altar of incense next week, the Ark of the Covenant the week after, and the mercy seat to finish. This is how the Lord relates to us. God, we are so grateful for your companionship. We know we don't deserve it. We certainly don't even deserve to be welcomed into your presence. And yet you continue to call us to yourself. God, like your people in the wilderness, we come before you weary, dirty, sinful, and yet you offer us forgiveness and restoration. God, like your people in the wilderness, you show us your ways, illuminating our path in a dark world. And like your people in the wilderness, you provide for our needs and give us audience before you. And so, Father, we present ourselves to you this week. We present ourselves for your honor and your glory. May we always be in your gaze before your holy presence. Lord, would you see us as your Son presents us, holy and consecrated for your pleasure. We trust you this week for the things that we need. You are our provider. You have always been faithful, and we know you will continue to be. Father, may we find full joy in you and in your interactions with us, each of us this week. May we not grow hard and stale as we would away from you. But we ask that you might sustain us by your proximity. Keep us as we've been brought in Jesus Christ, new and nourishing. For any who might wander close enough and have need for your generous provision, use us this week as an expression of your grace and of your loving kindness. Amen.